Good afternoon, everybody. David Von Asperen, Sacramento County, LOP. But today's topic is something I dealt with partly in LOP and then later in a fee-for-service, or LRP. My ongoing theme in the talks I've been giving, keep your chin up, have high confidence that you're doing the right thing, and then do your best. What I've done in this talk is tried to go picture heavy, especially on a session after lunch on the last day. Thank you for hanging in there with us. And where I have a letterhead exhibit up there, again, the intent is not to have you try to read that. Just focus on a couple of words in there that I've typically highlighted with a different color. I'd like to dedicate this talk to my old boss, Barry Marcus, PG. At least a few of you probably know him or at least know that name. He was a great boss, very responsive. If there's any boss types out in the audience, your staff loves it when you turn things around quickly for us. For example, on this project, it was escrow driven. Everything was hurry, hurry, hurry. Barry typically on this project and others would turn things around within the hour instead of letting something sit there for day after day in his inbox. Ironically, Erin mentioned yesterday that she's had roughly 160 some odd sites come through her voluntary cleanup program in 13 years and never heard anything from a peer agency. Well, this project was the exact opposite. I heard from not one but two sister agencies, and I'll tell you why as we get through the talk. My subject site's right in the middle of the red circle there, but just a few more contextual comments. Ironically, the residual contamination was not the result of a leaky UST case, nor was it the result of a closure under the new low-threat closure policy. Another thing, if you were here yesterday, you heard me say I'm a fan of GeoTracker. I really, really mean that. I use it whenever I can, for whatever I can. It's helpful to peer agencies, as turned out in this case. It's helpful for the public. And it's so easy to use. You know, some of my peers feel that, oh, God forbid, I can't upload a document because I'm not supposed to do that. The law says the consultant or the RP's got to do it. You'll spend more time fighting with the RP to get him to do it than it takes 32 seconds to upload a document yourself. So once in a while, let go of your ego. Just get it done. Another thing that was unique about this project was it was escrow driven. We sometimes get hung up, and the next session is all about this, but we get hung up on sites that are stuck. Well, I present to you that, and I don't mean to sound morbid, but with enough time, a current RP is going to die. So that means the property needs to be transacted, and that usually gets it cleaned up, or at least further investigated, or something will happen. And if they don't die, then it's going to be needed to be refinanced or something along that line. And even if it's going from a current owner to a family trust, the sophisticated landowners know to take care of environmental due diligence, even if a property's staying within their own family. And that'll also get them doing stuff. Lastly, ironically, this facility was proposed, and construction is now underway, I'm pleased to report. It was proposed to become a household hazardous waste collection facility for the city of Elk Grove. And that was one party of the escrow. They were the buyer, and they bought the property from a private entity. So here's the subject property. What I'd like you to take away from this slide is, relative to all the neighboring properties, which are much more modern concrete tilt-up buildings for the most part, and most of all the neighbors have nice paved yard areas, very modern, you know, but the subject site, being much older than all that other stuff, was a lot of dirt surface and very ephemeral site activities over most of the site. So it was a situation kind of ripe for indiscriminate contamination. Going back to the LOP background, there's where the LOP cleanup work occurred. There was a very large above-ground tank here, 225,000 gallon, which fed USTs, 3 of them, 10,000 each, located in a tank pit right adjacent to the AST. And notice that, again, there's vast yard areas out here that are unpaved, and also to the south off the edge of the picture, even more yard area. So the indiscriminate contamination was spread throughout these open yard areas, and even over here beneath the building footprint from decades of heavy machinery operation and that sort of thing, site maintenance activities on the machinery, so on and so forth. Now, these pictures stem from the LOP tank over-excavation and cleanup, but that's not the purpose of using these photos. I mean, the over-ex was cool. You don't see very many big over-exes these days, but this site had one, again, because it was non-LOP, cleanup fund driven, it was escrow driven. But I used the slide anyway to give you a flavor of what the site is like. Ephemeral debris piles came and went constantly. It was a building materials recycling facility. So wood waste predominantly would come by the truckload on a daily basis, and the site operator would grind it up over here and sell it off as sawdust for livestock bedding and that sort of thing. Another thing that happened at the site was recycling and refurbishing of pallets, and you can see thousands and thousands of recycled pallets there in inventory. Again, look in the background just to give you a feel for the randomness of the site, a lot of ephemeral storage and things like that. And of course, in the foreground, that's the UST pit over-excavation. Here's another distal view of, and again, this is a different pile of material awaiting recycling compared to the other one. The concrete there, that's part of the former secondary containment for the giant AST that used to sit there. Here's an overview of what the unpaved yard area looks like. It was subject to random grading just to smooth it out over the years, and because of that grading and ongoing changes to the site surface, that further complicated trying to characterize the site for indiscriminate contamination. Now, the over-ex was pretty extensive, and compared to the talks of my peers that had pretty sophisticated administrative ways to deal with residual contamination, mine was kind of old-fashioned, both in terms of the LOP leaky UST portion and later in terms of the indiscriminate contamination problem that came up. But there's the site foreman there, the consultant, so that gives you an idea of that was a pretty good size excavation. Total depth to get out of the contaminant was around 50 feet below grade. First water in this area was 90 feet below grade. Now, if there was anything good about this site, it was that the contamination, the fuel hydrocarbon for the LOP aspect, was readily distinguishable from the clean dirt. And there you see a pocket of it right there. Here's a close-up. Pretty obvious what the contaminated material was versus the clean or relatively clean overburden. And I have even a closer close-up. You can see the very obvious classic bluish-gray discoloration that shows degradation of the petroleum in anaerobic conditions. You can even see in this chunk of old hardpan the vesicles, which is a fancy word, I think, for the old root channels of ancient plants, for example. So I thought that was a cool, I still have that chunk of material. I also threw in a picture of one of several monitoring wells that were on the property. Here's what they look like when they start getting disturbed by a giant over-excavation. The good news on this case, however, was it was all done legally, because I tried to stay on top of this stuff, but so the wells were properly abandoned under permit ahead of the over-ex, but it was interesting to get to see things exposed. Even more interesting is the next picture. There's a chunk of the subsurface monitoring well in the sidewall of the over-ex, and we don't get to see a profile, a real-life profile of an active monitoring well very often, so I thought that was kind of cool. Here's a close-up of it. There's the grout annular seal right there. There's the old 2-inch monitoring well casing. And just for scale, you know, those excavators tended to be the bigger ones as opposed to smaller ones. Look how giant the teeth marks are. You know, those are pretty much 2-inch width teeth mark, same width as the casing of the monitoring well. Okay, so what do I mean by the indiscriminate contamination that existed on this site? Here's an example of the kind of stuff. Just sloppy, mechanical maintenance type stuff. Obviously open cans of waste oil. Or this site also had a lot of hydraulic equipment for grinding up the recycled wood waste. Another stormwater runoff of leaky crankcases, and this is probably a leaky crankcase to the extreme. That's the oil pan off of some piece of machinery they probably overhauled on the site. And they had some of this sort of stuff, you know, drippage, leakage from heavy machinery, just general sloppy. I'm sure you can all relate to it. You deal with it all the time. Although this is kind of a curious picture. This is actually an old telephone pole. So that's, you see here the wood, you can, if you look real close, you can see the growth rings in that old tree. And over decades in the hot Sacramento summers, that creosote that was on the outside of the pole, it tends to just ooze off. It kind of melts and slowly slinks off the sides of the telephone pole. So that was kind of unique. And here's another good example of indiscriminate contamination. Here's a chunk of, you know, oily subsurface soil, and you know, you got green grass growing above it, you've got what looks to be clean soil on top of it. So when you try to pre-characterize a site like this one, again, not counting the LOP, UST aspect, but the other stuff, it's darn near impossible to do in a cost-effective and or practical manner. For example, you can't even see it from the surface. So to find these little pockets, you'd have to just get lucky and drill into one. So all factors considered, it was recommended that a soil management plan be put into place. And that's what this is. The City of Elk Grove was the project proponent, so they went ahead and prepared it, because after they took control of the property, after closing escrow, they were going to be the ones responsible for clearing and grubbing the site and digging the new footings for the future building, making the new pavement sections. So it was appropriate for them to do that part of it. So here we are, demolition underway, and this is where the site started getting weird. And as I mentioned yesterday in a talk, it's not the site conditions or the geology or any of that normal scientific stuff that gets weird. What gets weird is the people involved sometimes, and sometimes some shady motives. It turns out that the demolition contractor on this site grossly underbid the project. So once he started his work, lo and behold, he alleged that there was some discolored, quote, contaminated, unquote, material hidden beneath the old building slab, and that was cause for a changed condition and a minimum, right off the bat, $30,000 demand for a change order request. And he even went so far as to take a couple of samples of this material and run it through a lab, and yeah, it had 100 or 200 ppm oil. In the grand scheme of things, that's nothing. And the contractor trying to fight for this change order phrased it all under the guise of, oh, I'm worried about my workers out there. You know, what if I'm exposing them to hazardous materials? So that is what led to the peer review by two sister agencies, and I'll get more on that in a second. Let me show you the close-up. In the back, there's an ink pen right there for scale, and here's a close-up. So some of that alleged contaminated material was actually sticking to the bottom of the concrete slab as it was demoed and turned over. And when you would turn over a chunk of this material, it had a very slight oily residual type of odor. So again, that was the demand for the change order. And it got so outlandish that rather than the demo guy load up this material and take it to his yard to recycle the concrete, the change order he was going for was for the City of Elk Grove to pay him to bring his portable crushing plant to this property and keep it all on site because, oh my goodness, it was illegal to transport this alleged slight skim of contamination on the bottom of the concrete. So, as you could imagine, the city, the project proponent, balked severely, and so did I, quite frankly, because I thought it was bogus. So the first thing the contractor did to try to get things to go his way was he filed a complaint with my office. So this is a complaint intake form, and at Sac County EMD, complaints start up at Elise. She's our division chief, and they wend their way down to who would be the logical staff person. Well, I was the lead caseworker when this was an LOP cleanup case, right? And I'd long since gotten that closed. So, credit to my management, they figured out who the right person was and asked me to go out to do this complaint intake. So even my first reaction going to the site cold turkey was suggested a soil management plan be prepared. Very logical. Obviously, the contractor still was not happy with that because he didn't get his change order. So he sent another complaint in, this time through OSHA, which deferred to DTSC. And prior to all of this, he had leaned on me to take action to help him get a change order. And our first response was, oh, excuse me, I bumped that microphone. Our first response was, we don't do worker safety stuff. That's not our purview. So we're not gonna do anything to help you get that change order. So formal complaint filed with DTSC. Within relatively quick time, DTSC wrote right back, and they concluded the tank site has been properly remediated and procedures are currently in place to properly handle incidental, I call it indiscriminate, contamination found during construction. So we were totally supported by a sister agency. And I'd like to digress one moment onto relationships. Events like this, some of you know I'm an officer in the Groundwater Resources Association, founded way back in 1992. I've been an officer of one form or another continuously since '92. You know, meeting people at events like this, they really can and do pay dividends. I've known Charlie Ridenauer for 15 some odd years, and I think the mere fact that when this complaint reached his desk, he saw I was the lead caseworker. Oh, I know David. And by the same token, when he called me to ask a few rudimentary questions, you know, I knew him. So right off the bat, that there was that rapport, and that allowed him to complete this review in mere days. So again, as you might imagine, the contractor wasn't happy because he didn't get a change order. So he turned us into another agency. This time it was Regional Water Quality Control Board, Central Valley, Region 5 up in Sacramento. And they basically concluded the same thing. The City of Elk Grove were satisfied under the oversight of the Sac County EMD. They are taking the necessary precautions to assure that contamination found at the site is and will be handled appropriately, and will be part that ties directly into implementation of the soil management plan. Okay, winding things up now. Here's the site under construction. This was taken back in early December, I believe. Here's some future parking area out here in the next picture. In the background, you can see the forms are up to lay the concrete floor of the future building. Now, what happened to the alleged contaminated material? Per the soil management plan, it was segregated and stored on site. Another good thing about this site is the first phase of development by the City of Elk Grove, they were only using a small portion of the overall site. So they had all this room. So I strongly suggested to them, make an appropriate storage area and put that alleged contaminated material off on the back 40. And it's exactly what they did. And they even went so far as to winterize it. The reason it's kind of a greenish color is it was freshly hydroseeded the day before I took this picture. Here's a close-up of it. They even went so far as to create a ditch along the toe of the pile with a berm all the way around it as well. It was very well done. I was very pleased. Everyone worked well together. Ultimately, the demo contractor, guess what happened to him? He got booted off the job. And the City of Elk Grove brought in a normal contractor to finish it off. And Charles alluded to it. Sometimes these low-level soil management type materials can, in fact, be reutilized on site. And in the background there, you can't quite see it, but there's a railroad, and this is a main line up and down the Central Valley, and perpendicular to that is a thoroughfare. And the City of Elk Grove, as part of their master plan build-out, they're going to build a giant 4-lane road. It's currently 2-lane with an at-grade railroad crossing. Future plan is to build 4-lane with an overcrossing. That so-called contaminated material might very well make perfect fill for the approach to the new bridge that'll be built over the railroad tracks. So, very interesting project in the face of adversity. We stuck to our original thoughts, and by golly, we were right, subject to not one, but 2 peer reviews by sister agencies. So, keep the faith, and things work out well. And to make it easy for all the various parties involved when there's an escrow, make free, when in doubt, put it on GeoTracker. Make it easy for people to find. And the way I distinguish these newer documents from the LOP UST closure, I prefaced each upload with post-UST closure soil management plan, post-UST closure peer review by DTSC. In other words, at a glance, you can see the newer letters that are post-UST closure. You scroll down deeper in GeoTracker and you see the older UST stuff. So that's the end of my presentation. Any questions? All right. I guess was I that good like Charles? No questions. Thank you.